By 1940, the second year of the European War, Hungary had managed to kickstart the production of Botond trucks, Csaba armored cars, and Toldi light tanks, with plans to add the newly designed Nimród tank hunters to the list. However, the army badly needed medium tanks that would provide greater firepower and better protection, along with the required level of mobility. Although the plan to reorganize all mobile troops into two armored and one mechanized cavalry divisions would only be finalized in the following year, officials were already looking at the available options with success. In April 1940, the Czech Škoda Works approached the Hungarian Ministry of Defense about the potential sale of medium tanks, offering three different designs. These were the LTVZ-35, with which the Hungarians were already familiar, as they had captured and repaired two such tanks back in 1939, along with two prototypes, the T-21 and the V-8H, which had not yet been finalized. In May, the T-21 was demonstrated, followed by field trials in June and July with two tanks. In August, the production rights were purchased, with the condition that the two sides would share subsequent development information with each other. The Hungarian version received the name 40M Turán, but as usual, several modifications had to be carried out before production could be initiated. The T-21 had originally been based on the LTVZ-35, which would become the Panzer 35T in German service. The suspension was practically the same, but the tank became larger and heavier, keeping the riveted armored design, but with several newly developed components. Romania had also tried to purchase the production rights, but their offer was refused by the German side, which then agreed to the Hungarian proposal instead. The Czech engineers went on to develop the T-22 and the T-23 on their own, but these were eventually scrapped, so only the T-21 lived on under its new name. In September 1940, the Ministry of Defense ordered 230 Turán tanks and awarded the contract to four different companies. As Guns and Mavag were busy building the Toldi light tanks, they were given a later deadline and a lower quota, 40 and 50 tanks, while the Hungarian wagon and machine factory in Győr and the Weiss works in Budapest had to produce 70 tanks each. Before actual work began, though, roughly 200 modifications had to be carried out because the T-21 was stillborn, suffering from numerous reliability issues. Also, Hungary did not have access to some of the components, such as the main gun, so these had to be replaced with domestic alternatives. First, the original two-man turret was replaced with a similar three-man version following German recommendations. A larger hatch was added on both sides for the crew. The Czech-made 47mm gun was modified to use 40mm ammunition that was available in large quantities, while the machine gun was replaced with a Hungarian 8mm Gebauer type. Armor was thicker when compared to the Toldi, but it was still only between 13 and 35mm, which was becoming inadequate by late 1940. While engineers worked on a new type of steel that did not require the now rare nickel alloy, focus turned to other aspects. For example, Škoda came up with a new design for the cylinder heads, which improved performance. This was adopted, but the previously manufactured components had to be discarded. The above changes delayed production by several months. When the new Hungarian-built prototype was tested in July 1941, engine issues arose immediately, followed by problems with the cooling system that was overwhelmed, the pneumatic system's pipes that clogged easily on muddy terrain, and the double clutch that required increased attention from the drivers. Another 40 modifications were made to fix these issues, while frontal armor was increased to 50mm by riveting a new 15mm plate onto the original increasing overall weight from 16.5 to 18.2 tons. To counter this, the 240 horsepower Škoda engine was replaced with the slightly stronger 260 horsepower Weiss V8H power plant. Even before the final design was completed, the ministry ordered another 309 tanks in September 1941 under the name Turán II. However, based on combat experience, this order was modified several times, so in the end only 55 of these tanks were built and delivered with the 40mm gun. In the meantime, work commenced on a second type, which would rely on a much stronger main gun, while keeping overall weight and size. By February 1942, the prototype of the new 75mm gun and its turret were ready, but I will detail this process in the next video on the 41M Turán. At the same time, work continued on the original model, and the improved prototype was delivered in March 1942. When testing revealed no serious issues, training began in May with the first 12 tanks. During the summer, it turned out that the transmission needed more work, so all Turán 1s were sent back to the factories, while 2nd Army and its 1st Armored Field Division left the country to fight at the Eastern Front, taking with them elements of all existing units, but without the new tanks, as they were obviously still not available. Back home, production continued, remaining issues were fixed, and although the double clutch could still pose a problem, this was to be solved with more training. Thus, the newly formed units, 1st and 3rd Armored Regiments, along with the Cavalry Division's Armored Battalion, trained extensively, which resulted in more headaches as the tanks started breaking down. The last Turáns of the first batch were delivered in 1943, followed by the 55 tanks of the second batch by May 1944, fulfilling the requirements of the 1943 Szabolcs Plan. Overall, 285 vehicles were produced with the 40mm gun. These had a crew of 5, a maximum speed of 47 km per hour, a range of 165 km, a length of 5.55 meters, a width of 2.44 meters, and a height of 2.3 meters. Unfortunately, by early 1944, they were hopelessly outdated. They were effective against the T-34s within 500 meters, aiming at the side, while the Soviet tanks could destroy them from 2 kilometers. Another weakness of the Turán was the complicated internals and the level of maintenance it required. When 1st Army arrived at the front with its 2nd Armored Division, the Turáns fought well, but suffered serious losses to enemy fire. In mid-April, when the Hungarian counterattack began, almost 30 Turáns were lost, while only 2 T-34 tanks were knocked out, both by the heavier 41M Turán that stood a slightly better chance. This constituted roughly 30% of 2nd Armored's overall strength, but at least the towns of Nadvorna and Delatin were taken by the remaining vehicles. Losses could not be replaced, so crews were trained on German panzers, which then served in 2nd Armored Division until the end of the war. In the meantime, 1st Cavalry Division fought and suffered heavy losses near Brest in June and July, losing most of its 62 Turán 1s. A few months later, in September, 1st Armored Division attacked and took Arad, but not long after, it was pushed back by the newly arrived Soviet tank units. This division was eventually surrounded and destroyed in Budapest when the city fell. The last remaining Turáns fought with 2nd Armored. In December 1944, there were still 35 Turán 1 tanks on hand, but not a single one was combat ready. Near the end of the war, they were destroyed by their own crews near Bratislava, not long before the unit surrendered to Soviet forces in Austria. Only a single sample remains today, with the 75mm main gun, which was taken to the Kubinka Tank Museum after the war. Questions remain regarding the existence of a single Turán 1, that could also be on their inventory, but not exhibited like the other Hungarian tanks. The Turán tank family was a good attempt from a smaller country to establish its own modern armored units. Having no experience in tank design or production, Hungarian engineers and the country's industry performed relatively well, although delays and a lack of raw materials worsened the end result. In the end, nothing could stop the Soviet juggernaut, no matter how many tanks were delivered to the units at the front.